Good evening. I'm Orson Welles. Tonight, broadcasting takes a giant leap. By way of introduction, this is a film about trickery and fraud, about lies. Tell it by the fireside or in a marketplace or in a movie. Almost any story is almost certainly some kind of lie. But not this time. No, this is a promise. During the next hour, everything you'll hear from us is really true and based on solid facts.
What kind of a spy do you think you are, Satchelfoot? Cat got your tongue? Come on out. Come out, whoever you are. Step out in the light and let's have a look at you.
Hello everybody and welcome to episode 29 of Film Gold, which will probably morph into episode 30 of Film Gold. And my guest today, the one and only David Ghosty Wills, who's been on Glass Onion on John Lennon, one of my other podcasts. He's been on Film Gold before. We did a Marlon Brando two-parter, and essentially we're going to be doing something very similar today with Orson Welles. I haven't got a title yet, but it's basically going to be a serious deep dive on Orson Welles, so, you know, get your scuba gear on, everyone. We're going deep. Ghosty, I'm going to save you the trouble, because you're a good friend of mine. I'm going to save you the trouble of doing the perfunctory introduction. You are a voice actor and a radio host, but can you just tell us about your podcast?
Oh, well, I do a podcast that is unique because it's the only one in existence that covers the career of Cliff Richard and the Shadows. And it's called We Say Yeah, reviewing every single release in chronological order. One of the great things about doing this podcast is that it takes me into musical areas I would not normally visit, such as the music composed for pantomimes or contemporary Christian music. So I'm confronting genres of music that I normally would not speak about in mixed company.
Okay, and that's called We Say Yeah.
Yes, We Say Yeah, that's true. And I think you're being very conservative with the idea that this may stretch into episode 30. I'm thinking episode 31 as well, but we'll see. We shall see.
Yeah, but I have enforced a bit of an embargo on tangents, though. You know. I mean, all some tangents are fine, but we don't need to tell the audience that COVID was the greatest year of our lives again.
One of my proudest moments on any podcast, that confession.
Yeah, my greatest time was something to do with a big bag of weed at a beach in Italy, I remember. Anyway. Right. I want to ask you a question as well. Did I meet you in London, or was that a dream? We did actually meet
in London. That's
because
true,
nowadays, you know the blurring of reality and almost reality. We did actually meet. Yeah, I didn't dream that, right?
True, and even though there are photos to prove it with AI technology, who knows if those are really true? You know, you have to look at the fingers and make sure that there are 5 fingers and not 6 on each hand. That's how you know.
I was going to say that was me and Orson Welles outside Abbey Road Studios, but you're not going to be buying that, are you?
Well, he did record a record. I mean, he recorded a song, at least. I had the single.
Oh, did he?
Sometime in the early 80s. I know what it is to be young, but you don't know what it is to be old.
Wow. Did he write it himself?
No. It's just a recitation with, I can't believe we're starting with this, but it's a recitation that was done, I'm going to guess, strictly for the money. I don't think there's any artistic value in it whatsoever.
Yeah, well, that's a theme. I mean, that would definitely not be in the part we're recording today, but that will be a theme going forward, right. Definitely. Yeah. Just quickly, before we start on Orson, I didn't ask you this last time. What are your broad film tastes? You got favourite actors, directors, that may, of course, include Orson Welles, but what are your general film tastes?
Orson would be up there. I tend to favor the Hollywood studio system of the 30s, 40s, and particularly the 50s, which I think is the most interesting time in certainly American Hollywood studio films, because that was the beginning of that era where we were going to have message films that were going to tackle social issues. Plus, there was that competition with television, so movies had to be bigger and in 3D and CinemaScope. Into the 60s and somewhat into the 70s, and I don't want to sound like one of those people who bemoan summer blockbusters, but I do kind of feel like things start to fall off around the time of Star Wars.
I would say Jaws, probably. I think Jaws was the first one, yeah. That obviously had some artistic merit.
Sure, and so does Star Wars, too. Yeah. But at that point, I feel like movies start to become more like theme park rides than films.
Have you got any favourite films? You know, have you got a top 3 or top 5 or any that you'd like to, your Desert Island films?
My favorite film, and it's got nothing to do with being a Beatles fan, but my favorite film is A Hard Day's Night.
Oh, interesting.
And after that, it would be City Lights, directed by Chaplin, of course, starring Chaplin. Yeah. And then, there's about 40 or 50 other movies who are vying for third place, but those are the top 2. I always feel self-conscious when I say A Hard Day's Night because people immediately roll their eyes and say, oh, it's because you're a Beatles fan. But it's not that, it's just such a joyous film. And it's one of those movies, your favorite of anything, I feel, has to be something that stands up to repeated viewings. And I'm never bored with A Hard Day's Night. Even though I've seen it so many times and I know what's coming, I'm always happy at the end of it. So I guess that's my favorite film.
Oh, fair enough, yeah. My listeners will know mine, but I've got this thing, a flick chart. There's a website, and I've pretty much got every film I've ever seen. They're not in a perfect order, but Raging Bull, by Scorsese, starring De Niro's been my favourite for a while, partly because I've got a fascination with boxing, and then 2001: A Space Odyssey and Apocalypse Now, because I do like an epic. Anyway,
Apocalypse Now will sort of factor into this first part of this discussion.
Yeah, we'll just prime the readers by saying there will be a section at some point of Marlon Brando comparisons, because when we did the Brando deep dive, which is called Marlon Brando the Greatest, you were referencing Orson Welles a lot. So I guess we might have a bit of reverse going on here. I've actually got a section in my notes called Brando comparisons, but then there are comparisons within the other sections of my notes. Any Brando fans will probably enjoy this almost as much as Orson fans. I feel like when we did the Brando show, we were both quote-unquote experts on Brando. I feel this conversation might be maybe a bit more like the Elvis one we had, where I know a bit more than the casual fan, but it seems like you know a lot. So I'll be giving you a bit of the Wikipedia version of his life, and then you can basically put me right as to how accurate it is. But, I mean, the thing is, because we were a bit delayed recording this, it's given me more time to sort of get to know Orson over the last few weeks. And, it's been a fantastic ride. I haven't managed to watch as many of his films as I'd like to, but I knew some of the interviews already. Our friend Mr. Cavett will come up. And really the thing to say, I mean, his vital stats in terms of birth and death, 1915 to 1985, so he died at 70. The sort of shorthand for Orson Welles is missed opportunities and spurned talent, and I don't necessarily agree with that, but just looking at his life, I mean, he packed a hell of a lot in. So is that shorthand right? We'll get into the details, but do you think there are missed opportunities there? In
terms of filmmaking later on, yes. And there's a reason for that, which we'll get into. I mean, there's a very big reason for that, is that Orson Welles needed a partner. And he had one at one time, but he needed someone to organize things for him because he was certainly not the kind of person who could do that. But I do feel that if Orson Welles had dropped dead at 23, he would have accomplished enough for anyone else's career, and no one would be having that discussion. We're at a point now where we don't even look before his film career started to see how much he achieved. In a way, depending on where your priorities are, you could look at his film career as the gravy on what was already an incredible career.
A great roast dinner. You're saying there was a roast. Yeah, well, you're being quite controversial there, aren't you? Because you're saying that if he dropped dead at 23 before he'd even made Citizen Caine, Citizen Cane's I'm looking at my apartment, there's a big elephant in the corner of the room, and it's Citizen Caine. We will get to that. Yeah, but just to say, I mean, I guess when we did the Brando show, we sort of said in a parallel universe, if Brando had behaved himself and was a bit less mercurial, would he have had a greater career? And I'm not sure. I think I don't know. I think you're taking something away and then you're adding something. If you've got a more conventional person, you get a bit less of the magic. I think it's what we concluded with Brando, right?
Well, you do get that with Orson Welles, too. You've also... There are a number of things in... it's a movie we'll talk about, I guess, in brief later on, but his version of Othello, where because of the way that was shot, which was sporadically, on several different continents over a long period of years, and it was all put together with editing, but there are some things that were, because there were financial problems, there were scenes that had to be totally rethought and improvised that are now considered one of the great moments of that film. But that was a case where perhaps Orson's disorganization and recklessness actually helped to create a scene that's memorable. So there is that argument.
Yeah, sure. I mean, we may as well reference the Beatles since we're both Beatles fans and you've been on my John Lennon podcast. But, of course, that's one of the things with the Beatles, wasn't it? They couldn't go to America for whatever reason, so they were in this slightly creaky, old-fashioned studio in EMI in Abbey Road. But then it was forced innovation. And I know what you're talking about with Othello, because that's one of the ones I have watched. And like I say, when we get there, whenever that is, we'll talk about that. All right, so I'm going to sort of give you some, like I said, Wikipedia biography of Orson, and I'll stop at various times so you can fill it in if that's all right.
Okay.
So he was born in Kenosha, Wisconsin, but I think in one of the interviews, because we've both seen that Arena special, haven't we? I think he said he was only there for a few months. Is that right? Or a couple of years?
I think it was a little longer than that, but he eventually moved to Illinois.
Yeah,
so he
Washington,
spent a lot of his time there.
Yeah. So I've got here, affluent family. I've got uprooted to Chicago at 4. Parents broke up at 7. Mother died of hepatitis when he was 9. Alcoholic father. I know this sounds terribly shorthand, so again, we will get into more details. I apologise for that, but, we're dealing with a guy who, like I said, packed a lot into his life. Alcoholic father who, I think Orson described him as a playboy, kind of womanizer. So, again, we got Brando there. Brando Sr. was a bit like that. So, talk about his early life.
Sure.
Is most of that correct?
It's leaving out some stuff. I mean, his mother was a concert pianist.
Yes.
She did die young, and Orson, when he was young, I guess the thought that he was also going to be a musician as well. And I know in one of the interviews, he talks about how he was one of those horrible children who was waving a baton around, and he says there's nothing more hateful on earth than a creature like that. And that's what he was. His father, though, was someone who was he was an inventor who actually was successful. And he invented something to do with a bicycle, and I wish I had it off the top of my head, but it was some innovation with bicycles.
Yeah, I had that. I haven't got that in my notes, so I did read that. Yeah, I didn't know that down. Anyway, yeah, it was an inventor.
Right, so
yeah.
Right, so he was an inventor, and he was successful, and there was certainly money, but then he did become an alcoholic and basically he didn't lose his fortune, but they kind of just lived off his fortune that he created when he was sober. And then, of course, Orson has an older brother who was institutionalized. And when I think about that, I immediately think of David Bowie and his brother as well, with the same kind of a story, who was institutionalized, who was sort of the shame of the family, which...
This is quite something if you think of what Bowie got up to,
Right. That's true.
Yeah,
and it's the same here. We don't really hear much about Orson's brother throughout the course of his life. It's hardly ever brought up. And it's interesting. I think maybe at that time in the teens and the early 20s, you could probably get away with something like that. I think nowadays it would be brought up probably in every interview that a celebrity had if they had a situation like that at home.
Oh, sure, yeah. You mentioned music. Orson played piano and violin, was quite prodigious. I believe he gave up music when his mother died. I guess
Correct.
That's not an accident, is it? I guess he associated it with his mother, yeah, of course. Sent to a family in Wyoming, stayed at a private art colony, becoming friends with the children of the Aga Khan. I feel like with Orson Welles, there's always this drive by people to make out that he was some sort of prince, Have you noticed that? And then later on, he almost becomes a king. He's like a fallen king, he's like King Lear or Falstaff or something like that, There's something about him.
Well, I guess it's
quite
because
grand.
His father, because of his wealth and his success early on, was able to take Orson around the world, and certainly around Europe, and he met a great many people who became world famous. Now, some of these people that Orson will mention in interviews, I doubt the veracity of these stories.
I was going to say
that he met Hitler and all that. I remember I was a child placed on his lap. I just find this so hard to believe. And Orson loved a good tale, but evidently his father did know a lot of prominent people, and there might have been a sense that, or maybe it was in Orson's mind himself that he was he was of royal lineage.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? And there's another, God, this is just like Brando comparisons central already. They're just coming thick and fast. I've got a quote here. I think this is from one of the biographers. Again, tell me if this is wrong. During the 3 years that Orson lived with his father, some observers wondered who took care of whom. And I do know, I've got a bit of a psychology background. There is a thing of, I don't know if we'd call Orson a troubled person. We'll get to that later. But there's a thing of often they are forced to take care of their parents because their parents aren't necessarily taking care of them. And with Marlon Brando, if you remember, his mother was a drunk, and do you remember there's all those stories of him and his sisters would have to try and find his mother who'd be passed out in a bar somewhere. So I wonder if there's a little bit of that maybe he grew up a bit too quickly, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, he would have had to, because you think the mother dying when he was young, I'm sure, exacerbated the situation with his father's drinking. So now his mother's out of the picture, his father's incapacitated, so he's forced to take on the grown-up role.
That's it, yeah. He went to prep school in Woodstock, Illinois. Nothing to do with the music festival. Quite poignantly, this was a line, if I tried to think of a home, it's that. And again, when we get to the end of this discussion, which could be a while, as we've said, there's definitely a poignancy about the whole thing, about him. Again, is this true? He said he played the Virgin Mary at 13 because he got into theatre and radio quite early. Is that true or not?
I don't know if that's true. I mean, he did a lot of theater. I mean, the Todd School for Boys doesn't exist anymore. I think one building exists, and it's now an apartment complex. So you could actually live at Orson Welles' famous Todd School for Boys. I know that he did a lot of theater there, and he befriended his lifelong mentor, Roger Hill, which he nicknamed Skipper, or I guess Skipper was his nickname on the campus. I just have to laugh because that's such a prep school nickname for a teacher. It's we're going canoeing, Skipper.
Yeah.
It also explains where Orson's accent comes from, because that is definitely a prep school accent that Orson has. At that time, he did a lot of theater, and if anyone ever reads, it's a biography that came out shortly before Orson passed away, written by Barbara Leeming, but written with Orson's cooperation, for better or worse, because he does charm her, and I think she takes everything he says at face value. But it's good because it's basically another long interview with Orson Welles. That's actually the first Orson Welles biography I ever read. It's a big book. It's a very thick book, and I remember going through it and thinking, how long are we going to spend talking about the Todd School for Boys? What the hell is this? And then you realize, yes, it's that important to him. I guess that was the first time he felt like he really belonged somewhere, because he was doing theater and he had, a mentor who was shepherding him along. So I could understand where he probably felt like he was becoming himself there at Todd School for Boys.
And was that mentor a pretty benevolent figure as well?
Yes.
So again, I hate to play coffee table psychiatrist, but it's a bit like the father he perhaps wished he had.
True. True.
But I mean, maybe everyone feels like that about their parents. Who knows? I've got here, when Wells was 15, his father died of heart and kidney failure, the age of 58, alone in a hotel in Chicago. Shortly before this, Wells had told his father that he refused to see him until he stopped drinking. Wells suffered lifelong guilt and despair over this. That could be the seed of some of the stuff we see later. Who knows? So as you mentioned, I think we were even on air when you mentioned it, what you said was his Beatles period was actually pre-Citizen Caine. And you're right, people probably don't know. I mean, everyone would know something about the War of the Worlds, even if they don't know the exact details. But what I've got here, stage debut at 16, and he kind of bluffed his way in with a backstory. And that made me think of Bob Dylan, actually, because Dylan was very good at that. You know, he had all kinds of apocryphal stories. He was on a walking and painting trip to Ireland. And again, this idea of the prince, there's a picture of him on a donkey cart, isn't there, with his painting materials. And he does not look, whatever he was, 16. Or he looks like a man trapped in a child's body. Do you feel that a little bit?
Yes. And it's interesting because I think he took his father's inheritance, basically, and spent it on this whirlwind trip of Europe that wound up with him at the Gate Theatre in Dublin, right. And then eventually he brings several of the folks from the Gate Theatre back to America to perform at the Todd School for Boys in some glorious event celebrating his own wonderfulness, I guess.
I mean, I'm sure he played up to it, but I think he genuinely, from what I've seen anyway, he did genuinely have quite a prodigious talent. He was obviously a bit of a Renaissance man, isn't he? Because he's got, would you say like his theatre and his radio career almost run in parallel from this point?
Pretty close, yeah. I think the radio career, I mean, he did a little bit of radio at the Todd School, but he really takes off around the time that his theater career really takes off. And then he's also funneling, it's something that becomes a hallmark of his entire career, his filmmaking career, is that he's taking the funds that he generates from his radio career and he's putting them into his theatrical productions to boost them a bit, to get better props, better costumes, better this. So he sort of subsidizes himself.
Yeah, I mean, I always quite admire hustlers as well, you know, as long as they're not doing it, you know, for necessarily criminal means. You know? Right. I think we realise we are all hustling, even when we don't realise we're doing it, you know. So reading about him, I kind of admired that about him. I've got here 1934, so he would have been 19, gets his first job on radio with the American School of the Air. That summer, Wells staged a drama festival at the Todd School. I think you said that already. He had established theatre and radio careers at 20. I'd say that's just about right, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's got those two professional careers.
He wrote a series of textbooks that were used in school curriculum for a number of years. He was only 19 when he wrote it with Skipper, with Roger Hill, called Everybody's Shakespeare. And it was a whole series of books, almost like an early version of Cliff's Notes, but they were ideas on how to stage Shakespeare plays for schools. And there was a whole series of, I think there's like 4 or 5 of these books, and they were in print for years and years, and various schools used them. So I don't know of any other student who would have just graduated and then immediately started writing a textbook.
Jeez, that's amazing, yeah.
Yeah, and he actually did the illustrations, from what I understand as well. And they were in print for years, not anymore, but I noticed the other day on eBay, because I was thinking, boy, I should have one of these. You know, I'm such a fan. And there is one of them that's signed by Orson Welles up on eBay, going for a ridiculous amount of money. They all seem to be very, very expensive. I've never run... I don't know what I would do with it if I had it, but it would just be fun to have. But yes, it was a whole series he had, Everybody's Shakespeare.
That's amazing. Yeah, I'm wondering whether he almost did too much in his early life.
Yeah.
It was like maybe everyone's got a limited amount of output.
Right.
Maybe it was a bit too much too early, I don't know. So we go forward to the Federal Theatre Project. I've got 1935 to 39 was a New Deal. People can research the New Deal. Program to fund theatre and other live artistic performances and entertainment programs in the US during the Great Depression, created as a relief measure to employ artists, writers, directors and theatre workers. John Houseman, that's an important name, director of the Negro Theatre Unit in New York, invited Wells to join the FTP, Federal Theatre Project, 1935. As you said, you know, I do love Orson, but I think he's a bit of an unreliable narrator, and some of the numbers he comes up with. Maybe it's true. He said he was on $1,500 a week, using his radio earnings to go into the stage productions, bypassing administrative red tape. That was obviously, I mean, I have a horror of red tape and bureaucracy. I actually hate it. You know, maybe we all do. Does that sound about right? He said, I'm so employed I forgot how to sleep, which is a good line.
Yeah, that would make sense because he does tell the story, and he is on so many radio shows playing multiple parts. Most famously, The Shadow, where he's Lamont Cranston. He wasn't the Shadow for very long, but he's the most famous person who played. Isn't it funny when we were talking about him, it's almost an afterthought that he was basically a superhero on the radio. That was an enormously popular show, up there with, say, Superman or something like that. But yes, he did work constantly. I think his most notable or the job that employed him the most was a radio newsreel type of program, I think called The March of Time. I might be confusing this with the Citizen
News on the
march, right.
Yeah.
But they would recreate historic moments, and Orson would play the various people, because obviously there would not be recordings of...
No, he was involved.
You name it.
He was involved with that, and funnily enough, we like to mention our heroes, so we mentioned Lennon, Dylan, Brando, whoever it is. I've just finished a big biography of Stanley Kubrick, so I was living in the Kubrick world just before the Orson Welles world. It's called Kubrick and Odyssey. It's a new biography, highly recommended for any Kubrick files there. I think Kubrick did a little bit of work for, what was it called? March of Time?
I think it's called March of Time, yeah.
I think, that sounds about right. Because I think News on the March was some sort of parody, wasn't it, when we get to Caine? Oh, very interesting. I noticed a bit of a pattern that Orson was definitely fast off the blocks, if you like, obviously with his film career, but I've got here the first production for the Federal Theatre Project, and this is something I did know about. Shakespeare's Macbeth with an entirely African-American cast of around 150. The production became known as Voodoo Macbeth because Wells changed the setting to a mythical island, suggesting the Haitian court of King Henri Christophe, with Haitian voodoo fulfilling the role of Scottish witchcraft. Now, before I let you run with that, I just want to say two things. Number one, it's hard now, nearly 100 years later, to know how revolutionary that was. And it's just like, with the Beatles arriving in America, or even the Sex Pistols on the Bill Grundy show swearing. Now it just doesn't seem like anything, but I bet that was a major deal. And the other thing to say is that Shakespeare, clearly what I've seen is that Orson had I didn't even know about these books that you told me about. That's absolutely amazing. But he obviously had an affinity with Shakespeare, and Shakespeare is ripe for reinterpretations. But again, would anyone else have thought of that? So what do you think about the Voodoo Macbeth?
Well, it's remarkable in the fact that there exists film. It was staged and recreated for something. And again, I wish I had done a little bit of more research on this, but I know it pops up in the documentary on Wells, where they show a little bit of this. It might have been done for a newsreel, but it was a sensation. It played in Harlem. And I know Orson had said on one of the interviews that at the end of, I think, the debut performance, the audience came out onto the stage to basically congratulate the actors. And he said, you'd never heard Shakespeare spoken so beautifully by people these were actors who had never performed Shakespeare before. And, he said it was just remarkable.
That reminds me, actually, because the Olivier film of Henry V recreates the Shakespeare Globe Theatre in London quite well, and the audience are almost on the stage there, so there's a certain intimacy. But that's amazing. Yeah, I love that. If we say pre-War of the World, War of the Worlds was 1938, we'll get to that in a sec. Was he actually a star at this point? What level of stardom was he at here?
Well, he was getting there, certainly by 1938, and within 2 years, he's on the cover of Time magazine, he's only 23. So, when we think about, and we've still got stuff to cover that hasn't happened yet. So you think about that in terms of 23, the Beatles are doing Please Please Me, right? So they're just sort of beginning their album career. And like I said, you've got enough here, and we still haven't finished it, that if it ended at 23, he would be remembered as this, revolutionary theater director who put on these unique productions of Shakespeare, or in the case of the following year, The Cradle Will Rock, which is a different kettle of fish, and all the radio work. All the radio work, which continues into the late 1940s.
Yeah, I was going to say, again, before really kind of deep diving myself in the research, I always thought, I didn't realise they ran parallel. The other thing I've got here, and I'll throw to you again in a sec, before War of the Worlds, Wells and Houseman broke with the Federal Theatre Project to form their own company, which is the Mercury Theatre, which we've all heard of, where he met Joseph Cotton, who's an actor I absolutely love, and others that we'd see in Citizen Kane. Norman Lloyd, who's one of them, said, "I think Orson was the greatest directorial talent we've ever had in the American theatre." The Mercury Theatre opened in November 1937 with Caesar, Wells's modern dress adaptation of Shakespeare's tragedy Julius Caesar, streamlined into an anti-fascist tour de force that Joseph Cotton later described as, quote, "so vigorous, so contemporary, it set Broadway on its ear." So what about that one?
Yeah, well, there's no footage of that exists, but there's plenty of photos, and it looks like there's minimal props. Everything's done with lighting, and it looks like it's inspired by the lighting of the Nuremberg rallies, right? And Orson's in it because he plays Brutus, so he's acting in that as well. But here we have, yet another Shakespeare radical, interpretation. And it's certainly ripe for the times. So he's got his finger on the pulse of what's happening in the world. And it was another sensation.
Yeah, makes me think of the film of The Wall, with Bob Geldof.
Right.
Makes me think of that because they sort of incorporated a bit of that sort of Nuremberg rally-esque.
Did we skip the Cradle Will Rock? Do you have that in your notes?
I don't. I just want to say one more thing about this one. We've got to remember as well, this is pre-Holocaust.
Yes.
if I didn't think about that, I'd think, anti-fascist. Okay, this is a few years after the war. It's not. It's 1937. So, this is a tangent. Unfortunately, we won't go on now. But I don't know how much was known about Hitler's activities. I haven't really studied 1930s history that well. But yeah, go on. Talk about Cradle Will Rock.
Yeah, so that was the year before, and that's just a notable play because there was some dispute between the Federal Theatre Project and then the Actors Union, and there were other unions too. I think it's like the WPA. Anyway, it resulted in a kind of rogue production of The Cradle Will Rock, and the audience were instructed to go from the theater that it was supposed to be playing at. They had locked the door, so they were unable to put on the production at that theater, and they found somewhere else they could do it, and he seated the actors in among the audience and just had someone play the piano for the songs, and the actors in the audience would just stood up and performed the play with the audience all around them. And it actually got more attention than probably the play would have gotten if it had opened properly. And it was seen as this political move to do this.
Oh, that's interesting. So that's 36,
That was 37.
Oh, it's 37, okay, but pre-Julius Caesar, right.
Right.
Oh, very interesting. Here's a quick question for you. It's just speculation. With that and the Voodoo Macbeth, we've got this sort of community feeling. And again, it's a bit like the Beatles at the Cavern, isn't it? Where the audience are almost on the stage. But
right.
Was Orson, in your opinion, a people person? Was he a community guy, or was he somehow apart, or perhaps he was both? What do you reckon?
I think he was both, because I know that anybody who worked for him, not with him, but worked for him, will always talk about, he was like a man of the people, and he was so loyal to all of the people that worked under him. Not necessarily the people he collaborated with on an equal level. So there is that strange dichotomy there. He is that, hey, I'm a people person, I'm a guy, as long as you know your place, I guess. Yeah. But if you're somebody who, you're collaborating with him, it almost inevitably becomes adversarial.
No, I know what you mean, because it's funny, a couple of years ago, I started a discussion group in the town where I live, and I called it Meaningful Conversations. And it was a fait accompli in that if you join the group, you were almost committed to have a meaningful conversation rather than just yak about nothing, which I think a lot of conversations are, to be honest. And I was very enthusiastic because I like having meaningful conversations. And someone after about 6 months said, "Oh, Antony, you're such a people person." I was thinking in my head, I'm really not. No, I like people, but I'm not one of those people that, I'm a sort of somewhere between an introvert and an extrovert, got a bit of both, really. But it's interesting, to think of that, because the Mercury Theatre, again, it does feel like a community. So you've got Agnes Moorehead and Everett Sloane and Joseph Cotton, with Orson as the leader. I think I'd agree with you there.
Right. Well, in this case, it would have been Orson and then John Houseman. And, you know, John Houseman he's so important for the Mercury Theater because, as he explained it, and I was just reading a book on Orson today before I came here, and I was just going through it. And it's funny because this came up and it was unrelated. It was a book about The Other Side of the Wind and the making of that film. But they talked about John Houseman and how John Houseman saw himself as someone who would give Orson all the tools he needed for him to flourish. And they were very, very successful together. And you could make the argument that once Houseman was out of the picture, that's when things start to fall apart and get chaotic. And Orson is struggling to get things done rather than just getting things done and enjoying that success.
Oh, very interesting. Well, this is one purely for the British listeners. I don't think anyone outside Britain will want. Have you ever heard of Brian Clough, the football manager, soccer manager?
No.
There's a clip, if you ever watch Muhammad Ali being interviewed by Parkinson, the angry interview, you know, just after he'd beaten Foreman.
Yes.
Brian Clough's in the audience, and there's even a clip of Muhammad Ali saying, "I've heard about this guy, Brian Clough, he's like an English version of me."
There's some fella in London, England, named some Brian Clough, some soccer player or something. I heard all the way in Indonesia that this fella talks too much. They say he's another Muhammad Ali. There's just one Muhammad Ali. I'm the talker. Now, Clough, I've had enough. Stop it.
Well, are you going to stop it? No, I want to fight him.
Or something like that. But Brian Clough was this kind of like a genius manager. He took this small provincial town and they won the European Cup twice in 2 years, which is insane. It would never happen now. But he had a kind of quieter guy who would scout players, and he would pick good players, and then Clough would work his magic. So it's interesting, when you've got these quote-unquote geniuses, you often have got a kind of quieter guy who's doing a bit of the legwork. And going back to what you said earlier, I think Peter Bogdanovich, who was a big Orson fan, he said something about when he was doing films, he needed someone to get the money. You know, you need someone to do the legwork, right?
Right.
Is that what you'd say?
Yeah, and that was Houseman's. That was his role.
Right.
You know, but then they fell out around the time of Caine.
So could Houseman challenge Wells, or do you think there was a line there?
Well, if you hear Orson talk about it, Orson was under the impression that John Houseman was in love with him. And
or
John
romantic,
Houseman,
literally, or just
yeah.
a big
Even
fan.
though John Houseman was married twice, and I don't think there's any innuendo or rumor about him. But I maybe Houseman was just in love with his talent. You know, it might have been that. But I know that they did reunite on one of those Merv Griffin type shows in the 1970s, which is a very strange thing to see because they were enemies for so long, and you can see them reuniting. And of course, it's in front of the cameras, and Orson's full of praise for John Houseman. Houseman is full of praise for Orson. And it's just remarkable to see that, because you wonder how much of this is, you know, there's a lot of truth in what's being said, but it's also maybe they're protected because both of them know that the cameras are on them and they're expected to say something nice. So maybe they are actually saying what they should be saying to each other.
We're just never going to know because there's a camera on.
Yes,
you know?
yeah.
Also, if you're listening, by the way, if you're listening from up above, I love you, but I only believe about 40% of what you do or say.
And he had a falling out with Bogdanovich too.
Oh, did he?
They repaired their friendship, but Bogdanovich also became persona non grata with Wells for a little while.
So part 3 of this podcast will be all the people he's fallen out with. And why.
There's plenty of them.
Right, let's get back to this. So, simultaneously with his work in the theatre, Wells worked extensively in radio as an actor, writer, director and producer, often without credit. Between 1935 and 37, he was earning as much as $2,000 a week, shuttling between radio studios at such a pace that he would arrive barely in time for a quick scan of his lines. And this was a line from somebody else. 85-year-old Chinaman? Yep, no problem. You know, he could... Right. And, of course, in Citizen Caine, he brilliantly played an old man towards the end.
Well, what he found out was that it wasn't illegal to hop a ride in an ambulance if you weren't
Yeah, that's
sick.
it. Just get into that. Great story. Yeah, I love it. He seems to be talented enough to have done that. I think he probably was. This is probably something we should save to the end, but I think he was. If genius exists, it seems like there's something a bit special going on there. That he just has these resources, these creative resources that the average person just would not have.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think of all the people we've talked about, this is the most impressive resume by the age of 23.
Yeah, I mean, John Lennon was good, but, he's only singing Last Night, I Love You, Girl, or whatever it was. Please, please me.
Right.
She loves you.
We have a series of textbooks. We're on Broadway. We've already gone to Dublin to paint. And, he's packed it all in a very, very short time. That's why I always compare that to the Beatles, because when you think about, as we've talked about many times, Please Please Me to Abbey Road, it's a blink and you miss it period of time. But it seems like an eternity. Well, he's packed a lifetime. I mean, this wears me out now. I couldn't even get close
just
to
reading it
my entire life. Yeah, exactly.
Well, I'd say the comparison would be Bob Dylan, because if you take post motorbike accident, just before let's say Nashville Skyline, he is 26, 27. He's already made 6, 7 massive albums, songs of about 16 verses, and you're thinking, where the hell has he got all this information from?
Right.
And he's raised 3 or 4 children already. It's absolutely unbelievable. I mean, even McCartney was humble enough to say, I probably haven't improved on Yesterday and Here, There and Everywhere and Hey Jude, which is no shame, because arguably no one has.
Right.
Anyway, is there anything pre-War of the Worlds, or should we get to that?
No, I mean, we should get to, yes, the Mercury Theater is famous enough that it is able to have a radio show. Initially, the radio show was going to be called First Person Singular, his Mercury Theater show. And the idea is that everything was going to be told in the first person. And the best example of that would be the Mercury Theater production of Dracula on the radio, which is wonderful because it's probably the most faithful, I guess, to the Bram Stoker's novel, because it's done as these series of letters back and forth. And he's managed to condense that all into an hour with commercials. And I think prior to that, he had done Les Miserables, which was like a long series of shows. But the intention with the Mercury Theater on the air was to... Well, I should back up a little bit, because radio at this point in the 1930s was everywhere. In America, certainly. Every home had a radio. It was as revolutionary as the Internet. It was like the Internet of its time.
Or TV, or TV just after that.
TV. I mean, the fact that you could hear, someone in another part of the world live. I mean, it was considered like a modern day miracle. But at the time, most of the entertainment on radio was very lowbrow. So the idea that Orson had was you could bring, I hate to say it's going to sound pandering, but you could bring highbrow material to the masses if you packaged it correctly. If you put it in, much like his Everybody's Shakespeare book, it's the same kind of idea. It's always repackaging and reinterpreting these things for as wide an audience as possible, doing it in such a radical way that it attracts attention. So he does that with the Mercury Theater on the air, and they do some pretty remarkable shows. There's one where they do, it's Rebecca, I think, and they have, is it Rebecca? They have the author, Daphne du Maurier, on the phone at the end of the production, where she's listening at a remote location, and they actually speak to the author at the end of the production. That was really, really interesting to hear. And I should point out, just for me, I don't know how it was in England, but certainly in America, radio drama nowadays is kind of all but forgotten. So I know that the BBC still has drama on.
Radio 4 has dramas, yeah.
The Archers just goes on forever, and right. But
you've heard of the Archers? Wow.
Yes, yeah,
that's incredible.
But in America, I think we have one show that I think is maybe similar to the Archers, and I can't think of the name of it now. But it's just gone on for 40 or 50 years. It's like quaint old folks in a small town type of show. But that's about it. And in the 70s and 80s, these companies started licensing out these things on cassette, all these various shows. So my grandmother, because I had an interest in this sort of thing, my grandmother purchased for me a box set of Orson Welles broadcasts called Theater of the Imagination, which I still own. And anyway, it didn't have War of the Worlds in it because that's one of those ones that you could kind of get anywhere. But it had all of these different productions, these Mercury Theater productions, including some other shows that Orson did later on, produced programs like This Is My Best and some other show. There was like the Lady Esther. It's just some makeup company had a program. He always had the same MO, which was, we're going to take this great novel by Emily Bronte and turn it into a half hour. But, it's always done with the best of intentions. And it had such a profound impact on me that it wound up, and Orson's radio career wound up being one of the central motivators for my getting into radio and doing radio theater and being involved in radio theater. So we always talk about these influences. Although I consider myself a Beatles fan, I think their influence was more towards my preteen and teenage years. But in terms of the direction my life would take, I would say that Orson's work, particularly on radio, of anybody, probably had the most profound impact on me.
Okay, so the box set came out subsequently, so it's a kind of a greatest hits of all his radio work.
Sort of, yes. I don't know how the rights situations go with these things, because some of these shows fall into the public domain. Some of them are in the public domain, but there are companies that insist they have the copyright. I'm not sure. It came out sometime in the 80s, this box set. But having only a vague awareness of Orson's radio work, hearing it in that context, like I was hearing not the typical shows you would hear, which would be The Shadow or him doing an episode of Suspense. A lot of the horror-themed stuff, because of War of the Worlds and that sort of thing, that was readily available. But hearing him doing an adaptation of Rebecca, or Jane Eyre or something like that on the radio was just a revelation in the way that, radio doesn't have to be, old-time radio doesn't have to be comedy. I mean, old-time radio could really shoot for the moon, could really try for something with a little more weight to it.
Yeah.
So that box set, and then just reading about Orson's radio involvement and then collecting his radio shows whenever I could find them, did create or foster in me this Orson-like desire to, I'm going to transform the nature of radio. I really was possessed with this kind of thinking. And in my own small way, on a very small local level, I think I fulfilled that promise with certain radio shows that I wrote and produced. I mean, certainly all throughout the 90s and into the early 2000s, my life totally revolved around radio theater and radio drama, getting actors together and writing scripts. I sort of lived a kind of bargain basement Orson Welles kind of existence.
Oh, don't put yourself down. Come on.
Well, no, it's true. Yeah. I mean, maybe there's someone in Teaneck, New Jersey who was wowed by that, but it didn't really go beyond the confines of this small town. But of anybody in entertainment, of the people that we've talked about, which would be Lennon, Brando, Elvis, Orson Welles, the one who had the most impact would be Orson Welles. The Beatles in a different way, because the Beatles sort of introduced me to other things, the Goon Show and things like that. But in terms of, what I would do with my life, I didn't pick up a guitar. I didn't decide to form a band. None of that happened. I didn't get into TM. That it really didn't do anything for me. But Orson's radio career in particular, not the film career, right? Because I didn't want to become a director or anything, but I was so maybe it's because radio just seemed very attainable. With film, you do need a budget, you do need a lot of help. With radio, you can get by with just your imagination and a good script.
That's interesting, yeah. Because I've thought quite a lot about doing more video podcasts, but to be honest, first of all, I don't really want to put my face out there all the time. And number two, there's something about, there's a mystery element. And there's a very strange thing when you hear someone's voice, sometimes for years. I had this with podcasts. You listen to a podcast for years, not even thinking about what the person looks like. And then you see them on video, you see a picture of them.
Yes.
And they're just completely different. I think ever since the TV, really, obviously radio's been in decline. I was a kid who loved radio. I loved TV as well, but I loved radio. And obviously my addiction to podcast consumption, as well as making podcasts, is a direct sort of extension of that. I think TV has taken so much away because giving you the visual is taking away some of the imagination.
Absolutely.
And particularly with news. I mean, you know all about what I think about mainstream media and stuff. The visuals are just even more telling the public what they're supposed to think about things. I don't have a problem with TV and film. I love them, but there are still radio files out there. And I guess, like I say, podcasts, a lot of people would probably listen to podcasts instead of listening to the radio. So they still exist. Can you tell us what age would you have been when you first heard him, as much as you can pinpoint it?
I would have been very young when I first heard War of the Worlds, or one of those shows like Suspense that he appeared on multiple times. Anything to do with Orson Welles and horror and science fiction, those shows were readily available. They just put them out on records. And, you could go to the Five and Dime and get an Orson Welles old-time radio show. But hearing the more substantial stuff, hearing the Mercury Theater on the air outside of the War of the Worlds broadcast, those were the things that really impacted me. And also the stories of Orson getting into radio, the story of him renting the ambulance, the story of what happened on the night of the War of the Worlds, and all of these great anecdotes were also part of this little booklet that came with this box set. And I still have it. I mean, it's a cassette box set. And it's in tatters now, but I held on to it for sentimental reason because, for good or bad, it did set me on this path. I mean, maybe I should have formed a band, but it really, really made an impact on me. As much as I love Orson's movies, I know that's basically the focus of this.
Well, not necessarily, because I didn't realize how many other strands there were to his bow.
I guess with the Mercury Theater on the air, when we get to the War of the Worlds, we're seeing, I guess, everything that's happened before. Voodoo Macbeth, Fascist Caesar. Now we're getting War of the Worlds, but as done as a series of news flashes during the world's most boring radio program, which is really why that seems so effective, because the fictitious show that you're supposed to be listening to, and of course, I guess, this took place on Halloween night, 1938, the show that you're supposed to be listening to, this fictitious music program with this orchestra playing in a ballroom, is so boring that the passage of time, the whole world is destroyed in about 30 minutes. It seems like it goes on for hours, but it's happening very quickly.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? He did announce that it was a production of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. But presumably, of course, people might be tuning in midway. So was the whole thing a series of news reports? How long was the whole production? Do we know?
It's 1 hour.
Oh, 1 hour.
So it's just an hour-long show. And yes, they announced the Mercury Theater on the air presents the H.G. Wells' The War of the Worlds. So you basically get this music playing in a ballroom, and then these news reports interrupt the music. Now, these news reports are harrowing to listen to. Something's landed in Grover's Mill, New Jersey, and here we are at the scene. Oh, there's a ray coming out of this ship, and then you hear everybody screaming, and then the news report cuts out. And then we could take you back to the ballroom, and you're like, what the hell just happened? What did I just listen to? Now, what happened was Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy were on opposite on a different radio station, and they had a very, very popular show. Mercury Theater on the Air was popular with the eggheads of America, but not necessarily the general public. And on Bergen and McCarthy, when they would have a musical guest, people would switch over to see what was on the other station. So they came over to this news broadcast that seemed to be happening, like they just turned the dial and all of a sudden they're hearing this news broadcast. They didn't hear the beginning of the show where it's an announcement that this is the War of the Worlds. Then they just didn't go back to Bergen and McCarthy. They stayed with the broadcast, not realizing that what they were listening to is fictitious. Now, I should say not everybody, because a lot of people heard this and thought this has to be a play or a skit or something, because I don't think CBS would have an exclusive on The End of the World. It would be on all the other channels if this was happening. Some people did figure it out and thought it was hilarious. But that portion of it, because the War of the Worlds broadcast is in two halves. The first half hour is the newscast. And it's really exceptional. If you've never heard it, it's exceptionally well done. It's really well done. The second half is a complete dramatization of the rest of the novel. And it's not done as a newscast. It's done as a straight radio drama. So anybody listening to that second half would realize that that's what they're listening to.
Oh, so it only took half an hour for this panic to set in and for thousands of people to abandon it. Ah, interesting. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've got here combination of the news bulletin form of the performance with the between breaks dial spinning habits of listeners was later reported to have created widespread confusion among listeners who failed to hear the introduction, although the extent of this confusion has come into question. Now, listeners, did you ever think Adolf Hitler would get mentioned twice in this podcast? The myth of the result created by the combination was reported as fact around the world and disparagingly mentioned by Adolf Hitler in a public speech. Yes, that's fairly random, isn't it? Yeah. The thing I wanted to say about this, I've never listened to the whole thing, I'll be honest. I've just heard mostly that Grover's Mill clip that you were talking about. That's the bit they always show, isn't it?
We are bringing you an eyewitness account of what's happening on the Wilmoth Farm, Grover's Mill, New Jersey. We now return you to Carl Phillips at Grover's Mill.
Ladies and gentlemen, Ladies and gentlemen, here I am, back of a stone wall that adjoins Mr. Wilmot's garden. From here, I get a sweep of the whole scene. I'll give you every detail as long as I can talk and as long as I can see. More state police have arrived. They're drawing up a cordon in front of the pit. About 30 of them. No need to push the crowd back now. They're willing to keep their distance. The captain's conferring with someone. Can't quite see who. Oh, yes, I believe it's Professor Pearson. Yes, it is. Now they've parted, and the professor moves around one side, studying the object while the captain and two policemen advance with something in their hands. I can see it now. It's a white handkerchief tied to a pole. Flag of truce. If those creatures know what that means, what anything means. Wait a minute, something's happening. Humped shape is rising out of the pit. I can make out a small beam of light against a mirror. What's that? There's a jet of flame springing from the mirror, and it leaps right at the advancing men. It strikes them head on. Oh, Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's caught up by the woods, the barns, the gas tanks for the automobiles, spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill. Evidently, there's some difficulty with our field transmission. However, we will return to that point at the earliest opportunity. In the meantime, we have a late bulletin from San Diego, California. Professor Indelkoffer, speaking at a dinner of the California Astronomical Society, expressed the opinion that the explosions on Mars are undoubtedly nothing more than severe volcanic disturbances on the surface of the planet. We continue now with our piano interlude.
Have you seen Night of the Living Dead, the Romero, the original one?
Yeah, of course. Mm-hmm.
One of my favourites, and we reviewed it, myself and Rob Ager. It just struck me when I was thinking about it, when I was researching. In that film, they very cleverly use radio reports and then news reports, if you remember. So the characters are watching TV. They're holed up in a house and they're watching TV. And the reports sound very similar. You know, there's been an outbreak of mass hysteria.
Right.
We're getting reports and... It's so brilliantly meta because the news reporter on the TV that the characters are watching, that we're also watching, they are getting information, the characters are getting information, and then we as the viewer of the film are getting information. So it's absolutely brilliantly done.
Reports, incredible as they seem, are not the results of mass hysteria. First eyewitness accounts of this grisly development came from people who were understandably frightened and almost incoherent. Officials and newsmen at first discounted those eyewitness descriptions as being beyond belief. However, the reports persisted. Medical examinations of some of the victims bore out the fact that they had been partially devoured. I think we have some late word just arriving, and I'll interrupt to bring this to you. This is the latest disclosure in a report from National Civil Defense Headquarters in Washington. It has been established that persons who have recently died have been returning to life and committing acts of murder. A widespread investigation of reports from funeral homes, morgues, and hospitals has concluded that the unburied dead are coming back to life and seeking human victims. It's hard for us here to believe what we're reporting to you, but it does seem to be a fact.
You're coming from a meeting regarding the explosion of the Venus probe, is that right?
Yes, that was the subject of the meeting.
You feel there is a connection between this and the phenomenon?
There's a definite connection.
In other words, you feel that the radiation on the Venus probe is enough to cause these mutations?
There was a very high degree of radiation.
Well, just a minute. I'm not sure that that's certain at all. I don't think that has been
irrefutably explanation that we have at this time.
In other words, it is the military's viewpoint that the radiation is not the cause of the mutation.
I can't speak for the entire military at this time, gentlemen. I
be...
must disagree with these gentlemen presently until this is irrefutably proved.
Everything is being done that can be done.
We'll have to hurry for our next meeting.
There's an actor as part of the Mercury Theater troupe who Orson knew did a great impression of FDR. And even though he's not announced as the president, they say, here's a message from the Attorney General. Because I've seen so many documentaries about this, but the actor said that Orson came to him and said, now you know what I want you to do. And he said, really? You want me to do? Yes. And he does it as Roosevelt. So when you hear it, it sounds like it's the president saying, citizens of the nation, today we face a trouble. So people hearing it were thinking, oh my God, now the president's on talking. We are so screwed. But it's just so well done. Actually, even listening to it now, it gives you goosebumps when you listen to it because you think it's so convincing, even as ridiculous as it is, that it would happen in 30 minutes. It's 30 minutes that feels like 5 hours. It's done really, really well.
Oh, I should listen to that, yeah. So they're having a fireside chat in the middle of a Martian invasion. That's pretty funny.
Yes. And then later on, because Orson did become friends with FDR.
Yeah, we're going to get to that, yeah.
Yeah, FDR said, this only goes to show that all the intelligent people listen to Charlie McCarthy.
Who's Charlie McCarthy?
So Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy is a ventriloquist and his dummy that were on the opposite network. So it was the Bergen and McCarthy program. You have to wonder how a ventriloquist, the whole idea is that you can't see his lips moving, but here he is on the radio, and he was very, very popular.
Oh, but ventriloquists on the radio.
Yes.
Oh, I need some time to think about that. Yeah.
So Edgar Bergen and Charlie McCarthy were like a sensation. They were when I was a kid, they were still around and still alive and would show up on television. Charlie McCarthy is a little dummy with a top hat and a monocle.
Oh, yes.
You're right. You might have seen them. I think they're in the Muppet movie, too, with Orson Welles, believe it or not.
We should talk about the next day.
There's your Virgin Mary performance. My God, with the most innocent-looking face you've ever seen.
I was just going to say, yeah. I mean, Orson looks about 12. He looks very undernourished. And he's brilliantly sort of quiet and understated. I think that's another thing with him and Brando and various other people, is this ability to do quite outlandish things, which he clearly did at various points in his life, but to also come across as fairly authentically quite quiet and innocent. But I'm gathering from your voice you don't think he was as innocent as he made out. What do you reckon?
Well, I've never seen him quite so contrite, but I will say he does say something in that press conference that's a little condescending, but it's to sort of shield him from any guilt. And I do think it's funny because of what happened the night before, that he's like, I just find it hard to believe that a story that is so well known to children would create this kind of outcry. Ouch. Which I thought was just so funny because it sort of puts everybody on note.
He should have put something in about the fact that like children maybe weren't fooled either. That was
right. Yeah.
Indeed. Were you aware of terror at the time you were giving this role? Were you aware that terror was going on throughout the nation?
Oh, no, of course not. You know, we did Dracula, and it seemed to me during Dracula I had high hopes that people would react as they do in a movie of that kind, and I don't know that they did, particularly, and so I'd given up. One doesn't believe in the radio audience much. You don't know whether they're listening or not. You have no idea how many people are listening or what they're thinking. I had every hope that the people would be excited as they would be at a melodrama.
Have you altered your plans for future programs in any way as a result of this incident?
Naturally, we will have to sit down and think very carefully about future broadcasts.
Have you make any specific changes in any programs that were already scheduled, such as next week's, for instance?
No.
Do you think, Mr. Wells, that you might have taken unfair advantage of the public in using a method as a conveyance for authentic news?
It is not a method original with me. It is used by many radio programs. I am terribly shocked by the effect it's had. I do not believe that the method is original with me or peculiar to the Mercury Theater's presentation.
Do you think there ought to be a law against such enactments as we had last night as a result of that?
I don't know what the legislation would be. I know that almost everybody in radio would do almost anything to avert the kind of thing that has happened, myself included, but I don't know what the legislation would be. Radio is new and we are learning about the effect it has on people. Every radio program tries to be more dramatic than life, as every play tries to be more dramatic than life, and every movie, not less so. I would have been surprised and hurt, as anybody would, if they'd been told that a presentation was less effective than life.
There's definitely there's something childlike about Orson in general. I think a lot of the people we've mentioned about him falling out with people, from what I've seen, and again, there's only watching documentaries where they're generally all going to be nice about him, they all seem to recognise that, I don't know, he was a bit like a child, would you say, in a way?
Sure, I could even with the baton that he kept describing, I see him always that way. It catapulted him into superstardom, though. I mean, he went from the Mercury Theater on the Air went from being a sustaining show, meaning a show without a sponsor, to suddenly renaming itself the Campbell's Playhouse because Campbell's Soup became the sponsor for the show. Right. And it very quickly led to his movie contract with RKO. And, he was already on the cover of Time magazine, but this really turned him into a superstar. And he did a lot of appearances on radio. Actually, he did a radio interview with H.G. Wells. So it's Orson and H.G. Wells talking about his production of The War of the Worlds, which is really interesting. You can hear that on YouTube, I'm sure. It's interesting in that H.G. Wells at the end turns it into a plug for Citizen Caine. He says, I understand you have a movie coming out.
Oh, yeah, I heard that. Yeah. Right. Oh, that was H.G. Wells.
Yeah, so that was kind of interesting. But Orson does a lot of appearances. He really milks it. So he gets a lot of attention. He does a lot of appearances on comedy shows where here he is, the man who fooled the nation, Orson Welles. And he was actually very successful at doing comedy, and he filled in for Jack Benny. When Jack Benny was ill, they brought Orson in as a guest host, and he was so successful at doing that Orson got his own comedy variety show called the Orson Welles Almanac. And
44, that was. Yeah.
It's an unusual radio show. It's not a very successful show when you listen to it because he just seems uncomfortable in the role of trying to be a comedian. But it does have one interesting aspect to it in that since Frank Sinatra was very popular at the time with Bobby Soxers, the joke on the show is that Orson would have these two young girls waiting for him at the door before he would go on. And, they were like Orson's two Bobby Soxers who thought of him as like a teen idol.
I was going to ask, we will talk about the marriages later on, but would there have been groupies? Do you think Orson was a sex symbol?
Oh, sure.
Yeah?
Well,
okay.
To some degree, he was already married. He was already married to Virginia by this time, his first wife.
Got married at 19, and it did last 5 years, which isn't too bad for a marriage at 19. But
once he goes Hollywood, and it's Rita Hayworth all the way.
Yeah, that's right. All right, folks, we're going to bring an end to part one. I think I'm going to squeeze however long our conversation is into 2 parts. So, Ghosty, thanks for doing part one, and you'll be back to see how much more Orson packed into his 70 years of life on this earth. That was quite poetic, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I'm not even going to say you've passed the audition. I wouldn't stoop that low. I think I've used it before, that's why. All right, see you soon.